Quorum call? Pardon me? Oh, I asked that the quorum call be terminated.
Without objection.
Okay. I just didn't hear it all that loudly, that's why. Mr. President, in my home state of Vermont and all across this country, the American people are deeply concerned about the war in Iraq. They want real debate here in Washington on this issue, and more importantly, they want real action. Frankly, I have a hard time understanding why some of my colleagues, regardless of what their position on the war might be, would try to prevent a vote on what is, at best, a very modest proposal that was brought forth this afternoon. If you like the Warner bill, you should vote for it. If you don't like it, you should vote against it. But in fairness to the American people, we should have a serious debate and a vote on this issue. Let me be very clear in giving you my perspective on this war. In my view, President Bush's war in Iraq has been a disaster. It is a war that we were misled into, and a war that many of us believed we never should have gotten into in the first place. This is a war that the administration was unprepared to fight. The administration has shown little understanding of the enemy or the historical context or the cultural context in which we found ourselves. Who will forget President Bush declaring mission accomplished aboard the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln when, in fact, the mission had barely begun? Who will forget President Cheney telling us that the insurgency was in its last throes just before some of the bloodiest months of the war took place? Who will ever forget those Bush advisors who predicted that the war would be a cakewalk, nothing to worry about, and that we would be greeted in Iraq as liberators? Mr. President, this war in Iraq has come at a very, very high price in so many ways. This is a war that has cost us terribly in American blood. As of today, we have lost some 3,100 brave American soldiers, 23,000 more have been wounded, and tens of thousands will come home with post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a war which, with the President's proposed increase, will cost us some $500 billion, with the price tag going up by $8 billion every single month. This cost is going to add to the huge national debt that we are already leaving to our children and grandchildren, and is going to make it more difficult for us to fund health care, education, environmental protection, affordable housing, child care, and the pressing needs of the middle class and working families of our country, not to mention the needs of our veterans, whose numbers are rapidly increasing as a result of this war. This is a war which has caused unimaginable horror for the people of Iraq, people who have suffered so long under the brutality of the Saddam Hussein dictatorship are suffering even more today. There are estimates that hundreds of thousands of Iraqis have been killed or wounded, and almost 2 million have been forced to flee their country, some 8% of their population. While civil war tears neighborhoods apart, children are without schools, and the Iraqi people lack electricity, health care, and other basic necessities of life. The doctors and nurses, teachers and administrators who have provided the professional infrastructure for the people of Iraq are now long gone. This is a war which has lowered our standing in the international community to an all-time low in our lifetimes, with leaders in democratic countries hesitant to work with us because of the lack of respect their citizens have for our president. Longtime friends and allies are simply wondering what is going on in the United States today. This is a war which has stretched our active duty military to the breaking point, as well as our National Guard and reserve forces. Morale in the military is low, and this war will have lasting impacts on the future recruitment, retention, and readiness of our nation's military. This is a war which has, in many respects, lowered our capability to effectively fight the very serious threats of international terrorism and Islamic extremism. 5 years after the horrific attacks of 9/11, Osama bin Laden remains free. Using the presence of U.S. troops in Iraq as their rallying call, al-Qaeda's strength around the world continues to grow, and the situation in Afghanistan is currently becoming more and more difficult. Mr. President, tragically, this administration has refused to listen to the American people who, in this last election, made it very clear that they want a new direction in Iraq, and they want this war wound down, not escalated. This administration has refused to listen to the thoughtful suggestions of the bipartisan Iraq study group, which included 2 former secretaries of state, including President Bush's own father's Secretary of State, as well as a former presidential chief of staff and a former Secretary of Defense, that it was time for a change in direction. This administration has refused to listen to the advice of our military leaders in Iraq, who told us that increasing troops from the United States would make it easier for the Iraqi government and military to avoid their political and military responsibilities. This administration has refused to listen to the Iraqi people who, according to a number of polls, have told us very strongly that they believe, in the midst of all of the horror and turmoil and violence within their country, that they would be safer and more secure if our troops left their country. In fact, this administration has tragically refused to listen to almost anybody except that same shrinking inner circle led by the Vice President, who have consistently been wrong on this issue from day one. Mr. President, as most everybody understands, and as the recent national intelligence estimate has just confirmed, the situation today in Iraq is extremely dire. The sad truth is that there are now no good options before us. There are simply less bad options. In Iraq today, according to Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, there are now at least 4 separate wars being fought, wars that our soldiers, who have fought with incredible bravery and skill, find themselves in the middle of. Let me quote Secretary Gates, who has recently stated, and I quote, "I believe there are essentially 4 wars going on in Iraq. One is Shia on Shia, principally in the south. The second is sectarian conflict, principally in Baghdad, but not solely. Third is the insurgency, and fourth is al-Qaeda," end of quote from Secretary of Defense Gates. Mr. President, the reality today, as described by the Secretary of Defense, has nothing to do with why President Bush got us into this war in the first place. In March of 2002, he told us that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and that they were poised to use those weapons against us. That was not true and certainly has no relevance to the war today. In 2002, the President told us that Iraq was somehow linked to al-Qaeda and bore some responsibility for the horrific 9/11 attack against our country. That also turned out not to be true and has no relevance to the situation we find ourselves in today. Mr. President, in the 2006 elections, the American people, in a loud and unmistakable voice, told us that they no longer had confidence in the Bush administration's handling of the war in Iraq. In my view, they told us that they wanted Congress to begin asserting its constitutional authority over this war, and they wanted us to rein in the administration. Most importantly, they told us that they wanted us to begin the process of bringing our troops home as soon as possible. And as Vermont Senator, that is exactly the effort I intend to make. In my view, the Warner resolution is far, far too weak. It is a baby step forward. Whether it is passed or not, it must be followed with much stronger legislation that has real teeth. Instead of just voicing our disapproval of President Bush's escalation of the war with a non-binding resolution, we should now be considering legislation that provides for the safe and orderly redeployment of virtually all of our troops out of Iraq within the next year, even as we continue to give support to the Iraq government and their military for the purpose of helping them accept their political and military responsibilities. That is the legislation that we should be debating. That is the legislation that we should be passing. How can we accomplish this withdrawal and redeployment? Regardless of what happens with the non-binding Warner bill, in the very near future, we must bring forth legislation onto the floor of the Senate that would prohibit the use of funds for an escalation of United States military forces without a specific new authorization from the Congress. Secondly, we must consider legislation to require a schedule for the return of a majority of American forces back home and the redeployment of the rest of the American forces from Iraq to other places. Finally, we must vote against any additional funding to increase troop levels. In addition, we must set conditions in any future funding bill so that the President is obliged to begin winding down this war. Mr. President, we are mired in a war that has gone on longer than American involvement in either the First World War or the Second World War. We will spend more money on this war in real dollars than we spent on either the Korean War or the war in Vietnam. Our standing in the international community has declined, and our ability to combat international terrorism has been seriously compromised. Mr. President, it is time to say no to this ill-conceived escalation. It is time to deploy our troops out of harm's way. It is time to end this war. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the appointments that are at the desk appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
The presiding officer. President. Okay. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Commerce Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-153 and that the bill be referred to the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs.
So ordered.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding the resolution of the Senate of January 24th, 1901, the traditional reading of Washington's farewell address take place on Monday, February 26, 2007 at 2 p.m.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 10 a.m. Tuesday, February 6th, that on Tuesday following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the morning hour be deemed expired, and the time for the two leaders reserved for their use later in the day, that there then be a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the first 30 minutes be under the control of the majority and the time allocated 10 minutes each. Leahy, Mikulski, and Kennedy, that the Republicans control the next 30 minutes with the time until 12:30 p.m. equally divided and controlled between the majority and the minority, that the Senate recess from 12:30 to 3:30 p.m. Tuesday in order to accommodate the respective conference work periods and to permit members to attend an intelligence briefing which begins at 2:30 p.m.
Without objection, so ordered.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate today, I now ask that the Senate stand adjourned under the previous order.
Senate. Without objection, the Senate stands in adjournment until 10